Les doy la más cordial bienvenida el día de hoy. Tenemos un desayuno
de hecho, a mí me tocó registrar.
Me honra mucho, me presento con ustedes primero. Soy Concepción Olavarrieta, soy la vicepresidenta mundial del Consejo Directivo del Millennium Project y soy la presidenta del Nodo Mexicano del Proyecto de México. El día de hoy tengo el orgullo de que nos acompañen en esta mesa Ana María Salazar, Jerome Glenn y Agustín Barrios Gómez. El propósito es intercambiar impresiones con ustedes después de las presentaciones que cada uno de ellos haga sobre lo que es la situación del futuro en el mundo. Cada uno de ustedes puede, la sesión va a ser en inglés, y cada uno de ustedes puede levantar la mano, haremos rondas de 3 preguntas y después las contestaciones correspondientes a cada uno de ellos. Si quieren enviarlas por escrito también pueden hacerlo, ahí hay unos papeles de Comentan, ¿sí? De tal manera que la podamos ir enriqueciendo toda la sesión. Curiosamente le estaba contando a Ana María que yo conocí a Ana María y a Jerome Glenn en el año de 2003 aquí en México, en un gran evento que organizó la Sociedad Mundial del Futuro, la World Future Society, que en México preside Julio Milla. A lo largo de estos años, probablemente 6 meses antes me encontré con Jerome, pero realmente fue en esos momentos cuando tuvimos oportunidades de cambiar impresiones y él venía a hablar justamente de este tema, la situación del futuro mundial. ¿Y qué es la diferencia, podría decirles, en relación con lo que es la visión como prospectivista? Y a lo mejor me voy a equivocar en los años, pero él es prácticamente una enciclopedia viviente porque tiene cerca de 50 años haciendo prospectiva. Es muy difícil que en estos momentos los buenos futuristas cuenten con esta gran visión de lo que ha sucedido alrededor del mundo. Hace 22 años se creó el Millennium Project como producto de una investigación que cuando él era el director del Consejo Americano para la Universidad de las Naciones Unidas, propuso que se hiciera un estudio sobre cuáles iban a ser los retos, amenazas y oportunidades del presente milenio. ¿Qué es lo relevante en relación con estos 15 retos? Son anteriores a los objetivos de desarrollo del milenio, a los 8 objetivos y a los 17 objetivos de desarrollo sustentable. Nos llevan a pensar mucho más allá. Aquí estamos hablando de retos. Naciones Unidas habla de objetivos con indicadores y metas, pero no se alcanzan siempre los objetivos porque no consideraron los retos que se impactan holísticamente y que es parte de lo que Jerome Glenn nos va a hablar el día de hoy. Cada uno de los nodos en el mundo, él también les hablará. Él ha creado desde 1996 hasta ahora 63 nodos en el mundo. Los nodos son núcleos de expertos. Cuenta en estos momentos el Millennium Project con 63 nodos en los 5 continentes y agrupa a cerca de 4.500 futuristas. Ustedes van a tener la oportunidad de poder apreciar todo lo que es el desarrollo de lo que ha sido en gran medida lo que es el Millennium Project, cuál es la situación actual en la que nos encontramos. Yo simplemente les avanzo que contará con 25 minutos, después haré una breve referencia sobre la historia, algo muy breve sobre Ana María Salazar, ella tendrá 10 minutos, hará comentarios al respecto, y después Agustín Barrios Gómez otros 10 minutos. Tendremos al final una sesión de 20 minutos para preguntas y respuestas, y desde luego siéntanse con la libertad para que al terminar la sesión se puedan acercar a él, puedan ser parte de lo que es toda esta sabiduría, lo que él llama el sistema de inteligencia de futuros globales. Jerome Glenn, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
There
you go. Your first test of strength.
Is this one on? Yes, it is.
Okay. Good morning. Buenos dias.
Taiwan? Yes, okay. Alrighty.
Let's see.
Yeah. This has got a tremendous amount of detail in it that I'm not going to be able to do justice to, but I will skip through certain parts that I think are most interesting. At the end, there's a list of website links that you can find out more if you want. And I hope that this PowerPoint presentation will be made available to everybody, so if I talk too fast or something was not clear, you can at leisure go through the presentation later on. Okay. The Millennium Project, very simply, is an idea to create a world think tank on behalf of all of us. This goes off.
Let's see if this works. Is this okay?
Let's see. All right, here we go. So the idea was to create a global participatory think tank put together by UN agencies, governments, NGOs, corporations, universities. Why? Because every institutional category has an advantage and a disadvantage. So we try to attract just the advantages of each, and so that we work through all these categories and are influenced by those categories. So what we makes sense to the whole system, we hope. So we call that a trans institution. A trans institution has no legal personhood. It's just a concept. We're a non-profit, but we'd like to get Mexico and other countries to amend their corporate law to add into non-profit, profit, and then trans-institutional law. Trans-institution would be one whose board or governing council, or whatever, has players from each of these. The people who do the work from all of these, but not a majority of any one. The money comes from all of these, but not a majority of any one. And the value added should go to all of these, but not a majority of any one. Which gives you a flexibility unlike other institutional categories in the world. So far, we haven't got anybody to make that change. But the first country that does it, we will register the Millennium Project in it, and Xerox the legislation and give it to every legislature in the world immediately. Okay, so we have 63 nodes around the world. A node is a group of individuals and institutions who identify leading thinkers to answer global questions. And then that information comes back to the node, translated into different languages, and shared with the public like we're doing today. I don't expect you to look at all of this, but you can look later on. The point here is that our support comes, not all at the same time, at different years, come from a completely diverse set of inputs. Very often you have, or you've probably never seen an organization funded both by UNESCO and by the US Army.
Yeah.
And this is a range of some of the different kinds of studies that we've done over the years. We also have a complete, relatively complete set of methods to explore the future. Some people say, well, they do future studies and perspective and foresight, and what do? They do scenarios. That's okay. That's only one of 37 methods. The reason I say 37 is because of an introductory chapter and a concluding chapter. So it's 37 different methods. And we will update this online from time to time as well. Then we put it all into a collective intelligence system that we hope increasingly the thought leaders of the world will interact and be available to the public so that we can know what humanity thinks as a whole about its future and what it needs to do. 15 global challenges. This is a framework that we created to help understand and track global change. You can read these later. We don't have a whole lot of time to go through all of these. But what we do is we update and see what better insights in them. So we have a cumulative wisdom about the future, rather than doing a study, put it on the shelf, and then do another study, as if the two studies have nothing to do with each other, right? Well, your brain doesn't work that way. You get a new piece of information that makes new neural connections, and hopefully you get a little smarter as you go along. So the purpose of these 15 challenges was to give one, a range of what we need to consider, two, a way of tracking global change, and three, to see if we are in fact improving our thinking. Because I can look at what we wrote last year, the year before that, and see is there improvement or not. We put these challenges out to the world and say, okay, if we want to measure progress and regress, what would we measure? What indicators would we measure? We put these indicators into an index, and if you'll notice, in 2007, 2008, we were starting to go up very nicely there. But then along came, my apologies, the American financial crisis, and the rest of the world had a very bad cold and pneumonia, and we dipped down for a while. Now people say, well look, we were recovering, yes, but look where we might have been had we not had that. That's a heck of a gap. So when people say, well, you know, we came out of okay, well it's better than not coming out okay, yes. But it was a big impact, more than people realize. So we have a way of giving a report card to the world, like saying, okay, we take a look at those indicators. Where are we winning and where are we losing? Well, we're winning in the area of living longer, healthier lives. We're beating poverty faster than anybody thought possible, by the way. When it says that the extreme poverty may be wiped out in 2030, that is a trend projection, by the way. It's not Participa. Okay. And we're wealthier than before, we're education, more educated, water resources, and more. We've got several billion people with water resources in the last 15 to 20 years, which is an amazing achievement. However, the water tables are going down around the world. So although we're doing great right now, the water tables are telling us that water wells around the world will go dry at this point. And when they go dry, you have to migrate to a new place, and you migrate, there's people there, and they're not going to be happy about that. So there's tremendous water conflicts potentially coming up, even though we have done an extremely excellent job of getting a lot of water to a lot of people. Energy efficiency is improving, child mortality has dropped, internet users, over half the world now is connected to the internet. And where we're losing is very serious. We're losing in the areas of environment, social unrest, terrorism, corruption, and organized crime. So, I think it's... Yes. There is more people being polite with each other around the world right now than ever before in history. Absolutely true. However, this is the way I would characterize the whole thing. We are winning more than we're losing. However, where we're losing is very serious. So you don't have a right to be pessimistic, but you don't have a right to go to sleep either. Okay, one of the areas we stressed in this particular report was the confusion around artificial intelligence. There are three, we classify three kinds of artificial intelligence, and they're different. They're as different as saying that the fax machine and the internet are the same thing. They're both part of the information age, but they're clearly not the same thing. Narrow intelligence is what we have today. The AI for driving a car cannot diagnose cancer. The AI for diagnosing cancer cannot drive a car. But both of those will get smarter every time they keep reusing and using and using and using. So the acceleration of intelligence does increase, but within the narrow categories. Artificial general intelligence is different. That's more like you, in the sense that you can adapt to a new situation that you've never seen before. You integrate what you know in one area to another area. Artificial general intelligence is a far bigger impact on the economy and employment than narrow. Most of the studies that you've seen talk about how many truck drivers are going to be knocked out by artificial intelligence. That's narrow intelligence. How many call centers are going to be wiped out by artificial intelligence? That's narrow intelligence. All of the stuff that you're really hearing about is narrow intelligence. But when you hear about the warnings from Elon Musk and the rest of these folks, they're talking about the third category. And so the third category is general intelligence that eventually evolves to set its own goals independent of us. That's what science fiction is talking about. That's the big worry. Not that the first one isn't a worry too, all right? But if you take a look at the whole human species, number 3 is a very big deal. So we wrote some scenarios about what to do about all this sort of stuff, which I'll talk about in a second. But another point that I want to add into this equation is that when we talk about a lot of these employment effects, we keep talking about AI, and as I said, in a limited way, and a little bit about robotics. But we don't talk about synthetic biology and genomics. How can that have an impact on employment? Synthetic biology is not genetic engineering. Genetic engineering, you take DNA, you knock something out, you put something in, it still arose, but it happens to glow. It didn't glow before, but it still arose. Synthetic biology is you sit in front of a computer and you figure out what are the capabilities I want, what are the genetic pieces that have that capability, I put those pieces together, I run a little software program to see if this new DNA has never been there before, is it coherent? And if it is, then I buy those pieces and assemble them, put them in a petri dish, and make a new species that's never been on the planet before. That's synthetic biology. Think of all the things that nature can do that you cannot do. And then this is a way that you can start to do those things. This is gigantic. I would say synthetic biology revolution, in the future, we look back on and say that was a bigger deal than the steam engine. All right? Now, an example of how it gets to unemployment. Let's say I want to clean up this room. Normally, you come in with a vacuum cleaner and an employee and so forth, right? And so electricity. Well, if I can make a little microorganism and reproduce it, a whole bunch of them, and put it in the corner like a powder, then I have it programmed such that it just rolls around all night long, put the dust there, rolling back, put the dust there, rolling back, rolling, all night long. Next morning I come up, there's a pile of dust. There's no vacuum cleaner salesman, there's no vacuum cleaner, there's no electricity, there's no nothing. All right? So it's not just AI. Synthetic biology is a big deal too. Along with computational science, this is also an area that's not well understood. The old idea of science, as you remember, is you do an observation, you form a hypothesis, you come up with an experiment, you create a laboratory, you run the experiment, you do et cetera, all right? And you got to publish a 6-month article. Then somebody else is supposed to duplicate that research based upon her. That's really slow. Yeah. Now, computational science is not that. Computational science is you make a computer simulation and you run thousands and thousands of experiments. You can also send out a note to the world to say, hey, if you have some unused time on your computer, would you like to dedicate it to do computer matching on molecular possibilities for beating cancer? Right? So you can create a supercomputer at no cost. Anybody that knows how to do this can create a supercomputer at no cost to do scientific research. Increasingly, people will catch on and more of this will happen. We still have people doing science the old way, and we still should have some people doing it the old way. But I'm bringing this up to say that this will accelerate scientific breakthroughs far beyond what people normally talk about when they talk about the future of science and technology. Cloud and big data analytics, you're all aware of that. Artificial and augmented reality, you're aware of that. Nanotechnology, two kinds. What we have today is big machine making little things. Eventually, we may be able to figure out how to have little things make big things. We haven't done that yet. That was the original idea of Eric Drexler. But a leaf is nanotechnology for food. We haven't figured out how to do that. All right, we probably will. So if we do, that is the engines of creation that this guy was talking about. That becomes a gigantic thing because you can have little tiny things making all kinds of things in your basement eventually. It also means you could have some nanotech armies and you gotta watch about that. Anyway, that's another story. The Internet of Things, Internet of Everything, tell everybody, semantic web, quantum computing. Now, I'm going to go on the record to say what I think that is. And usually when you say what you think quantum computing is, it means you don't know what you're talking about. So that's my disclaimer. As I understand it, in quantum mechanics is the idea that every action can occur, does occur. Which means there's I don't want to say infinite, because that's a big word, but an awful lot of different parallel universes. So if you have a computer in your universe and have the ability to use other complement ones and other parallels simultaneously, that means you can do extremely fast computation simultaneously. That's what quantum computer is, as I understand it. Now, every time I update the state of the future, the qubits, as they're called, the elements that you need to make this thing work, have increased every year. So it looks like we may have quantum computing. It's not for sure, but we... Now, if you take quantum computing and artificial general intelligence, and then take some tequila, you will see a different... Let alone all the rest of this stuff. That's just two. Let alone the rest of them. Okay. Telepresence, holographic communications, intelligence augmentation, collective intelligence, blockchain, 3D, 4D printing of materials and biology, drones, driverless cars, and other autonomous vehicles, conscious technology, and synergies among these, which is the big deal. Because we tend to think that the future of technology is a bunch of linear silos. That's not what happens. What happens is this. How many different technologies is your phone right now integrating? More than you're even using. I mean, none of us are using all the capabilities, just too many, right? So think of these future technologies as a Rubik's Cube. You can mix and match and put new combinations together. Or you can braid them together, make new kinds of capabilities that have never been there before. So this leads us to the inevitability of new economics. Just as the feudal England was different than the industrial economics. Same deal. We know that the concentration of wealth is increasing, the gaps are widening, employmentless economic growth seems the new norm, return on investment in capital and technology is usually better than labor. Future technologies can replace much of human labor, whether mental or physical labor. So long-term structural unemployment is a business as usual or surprise-free forecast. Now you apply that to society and you have global instability. Now there's nothing in there that any economist has told me is wrong. And when they do these studies, and we did a review of a lot of these studies, when it got down to what do, they basically had one answer. STEM education, science, technology, education. Okay, that's a good idea, and you should do that. But in the year 2050, you've got a workforce, conservatively, of 6 billion people. Out of the 6 billion people, how many people will really make a living on science and technology? Maybe 1 in 10, maybe 1 in 5. Well, this means you've got billions of people that are not happy. Okay, so what do we do about this? We created we read a whole bunch of literature on this. That's how I came up with the comment that none of the studies looked at synthetic biology, because I read, not every single one, but I read probably 50 or 60 of these things. We took the questions that weren't asked, and those questions that were asked but answered poorly in our judgment, and we made that a real-time Delphi questionnaire. We take the results, we made 3 alternative scenarios, we took the scenario graphs, we had them reviewed by everybody around the world, and we gave them to each country that has a node around the world to use as input to national workshops to create strategies to come up with it. And so far there's been 19 countries that have done it, and over 100 strategies. So STEM is one of the 100 ideas there. In chapter 3, I skipped over very quickly, which was the one on terrorism. A quick note on terrorism. NATO asked us to do a workshop on the future of terrorism. The workshop and all the papers are available. You can go to our website, you can click them on, you can get every single one. We don't do classified stuff. We bring a lot of classified people together sometimes. And we distilled it into a chapter, into the book. The thing that I stressed in there is what we call CMAD, single individual massively destructive. That's where an individual acting alone makes and deploys a weapon of mass destruction. There's a variety of ways to do that, and I don't want you to take notes. But it's possible. Which means that if you do everything right in Mexico, but a CMAD happens in Australia, you get impacted. So this is a global issue. We have to act as a family. And I think there's 3 elements to the strategy. One is technical means. That's classified not by business, but it would be things like nanosensors in public spaces to track the flow of molecules across an area. Then mesh networks alerting each other to what's going on. That won't solve everything, but it's a big deal. The second element of the triad is education and cognitive science. We're learning a lot about how the brain works. We're learning a lot about human behavior. We're not applying it much. Ever heard of a teacher told you how they implement what they're learning, what we as a species are learning about cognitive science, and how they apply that and how they teach? There's a gap. But that gap can be brought together. You know? So that reduces the numbers of crazy people. And it's a good idea to do anyway. We want to have healthy human beings. So let's apply what we know to help healthy human beings. It doesn't solve it, it reduces the problem. The third one is the one the Millennium Project wants you to do. And that is, what's the role of the family and the community in preventing this development in the first place? Because we cut across a lot of different cultures and institutions, we're in a unique position to be trusted to actually have such a study. We've not gotten any funding on that yet, but we'll see. So the first scenario we did on the work technology is, it's a mixed bag, it's complicated. This is a projection into 2050, which means a lot of change by 2050 because there's acceleration. So business as usual is a lot of change, right? But you have good stuff and bad stuff. The second one, if you have some friends that are just too optimistic, have them read scenario 2. Scenario 2 is really bad, but it's also, unfortunately, really plausible. If we don't make certain decisions, scenario 2 is possible. This is where you have, I'll come to that in a second, but imagine the political economic system being taken over by a lot of people that aren't too nice. 3, if humans were free, the self-actualizing economy. This is where we change into a new kind of an economic, evolve into a new kind of an economic base, and freeing up the human spirit. Just as, not to be sexist here, but as home appliances freed up women from a lot of drudgery, women became more free. They could be more self-actualized. They're not done yet, but it's still in process. So in a similar way, a lot of these technologies could do it for the whole species. Okay, these are the countries where we've done these workshops so far. One of the assumptions here is that in the year 2000, we had about 3 billion people in the workforce. We figure there's about 6 billion by 2050 or so. You'll notice that in the category, by employed, I mean somebody who gets a job, you go somewhere and you get a salary. Right? Even in the worst case scenario, you still need 1 billion people to make the system work. In the positive scenario, you still need about 1 billion people. When economists talk about how many people do you need to make the economy work, they forget to add the other question, how many people do you need to make civilization worthwhile? That's a much bigger number. And that becomes in the scenario 3 to some degree. The self-employed, there's a lot of ways self-employed will manifest itself, but you can see in scenario 3, you got 3 billion people there, unemployed or in transition, still large numbers, and that's hard to get the whole world to work. You know, we've got to be plausible here. And the informal economy, that simply means they don't report taxes or they don't use regular systems, but that is still a large number in the world. Okay. So, in the first scenario, we project out, imagine living in a world that's hands-free, phones-free, laptop-free, AI-human symbiosis with things like this. It then connects you to everything in the world. So instead of having your iPhone in your pocket, you look as you're walking down the street, you use certain keywords, and you make a deal on some blockchain sort of a deal. By the time you get to the next red light, you got it done. That is not impossible. In the same way that if you roll back before the old telephones, the idea of walking down the street and talking to somebody in another country sounds ridiculous. Now, people walk down, it looks like they're talking to themselves, and we accept it. We might be able to do much more than talk to ourselves, which means that we may be quite an augmented species. So the idea of our world being both virtual reality, augmented reality, and physical reality all meshed into one continuous system will become, in this system, as a trend projection, normal. That's a trend projection. No surprise in this. Scenario 2 is not that. Scenario 2, they don't take this idea of artificial intelligence going to general intelligence seriously. We had continue the polarization between the different groups, whether they're Shia and Sunni, or whether they're Trump or anti-Trump, or whatever the silos are. They just continue to get worse, which means that decisions aren't made. And when decisions aren't made, like in Somalia, we know it fills the gap. Different kinds of militias, organized crimes, and so forth. And they've got to be able to, and organized crime is not going to ignore all those technologies I said. Organized crime can buy the best software talent the world has to offer. And if the best the world has to offer is working for organized crime, then you got to take that into account in looking at what's going on. So you got something that looks like this in scenario 2. AI makes the combination far more powerful. So you can take organized crime, terrorism, corruption, and information warfare, which we're now getting more aware of. Those four totally get interdependent and not separable in that sort of scenario. So it makes democracy and free markets an illusion. The third one is governments around the world and people around the world start to take seriously some of the things we just said, come up with some good strategies, make the cultural changes that need to be made, the arts and entertainment and movies and television series and so forth, starts to engage the public, getting ready for the employment-less kind of a world, but the self-actualization world with a guaranteed income. Guaranteed income, in my judgment, is not financially sustainable today. That doesn't mean it's a bad idea. It just means it's not feasible today. Because if you take two curves, one curve, all these new technologies are going to eventually bring the cost of living down. I mean, if you have AI doing all the diagnostics, what are you paying a doctor for? And if it's simply an enter on your eyelash, what's the cost? Right? So you take all these things out, and eventually the cost of living will go down. Right now, university education should be almost free, but we don't have a culture to back it up. Right? So, just imagine one curve, your cost of living is going up, slowly starting to go, topping out and starting to come down, which means what you have to pay people in a guaranteed income is less in the future than it is now. It'll still go up for a while, and it's still not feasible as a result, but it'll start to go down. The second curve, the curve starts to go up, and that is the income on taxes from all these new technologies. That's a lot of income coming up. So these two curves will eventually cross over. At that point, it becomes financially sustainable. We should plan ahead for this. We should think about this. We shouldn't rush into it. We shouldn't say, I don't like it or I do like it. We didn't say that. We should study it. We've got to know what we're doing. Because if we do this right, we could have a fabulous civilization. I mean, how many times have you written a proposal and it got turned down and you didn't do it? Well, what happens if that's no longer an issue? Because if you have a basic income, you're not going to make much, but a basic income so you're not thrown in the street, then you can go ahead with other colleagues who also aren't thrown in the street and just begin just to do it. This whole study that I just talked about, the research, the scenarios, and the workshops, the whole thing across the board, for global cost, zero, 100% voluntary. And from my view, it's better than all the other studies that have done so far, very cost effective. Now, I'm not in favor of that. We'd like to have some funding. But just to point out that it's a mindset that has to shift. Because in the past, if we didn't get funding, we didn't do it. But we said, this is too important, we'll do it anyway. Just do it, as those likes to say. All right, now imagine you've got an avatar. You wake up in the morning, or like you go to sleep at night, and your avatar is running around the whole this general intelligence system, the quantum computer, all that sort of stuff, and wakes you up in the morning and says, you know, I found that you 10,000 things. Now, I know you can't do all 10,000, so let's have a conversation. And you work out, and oh, by the way, I've done smart contracts while you're asleep, so anything you agree to is already agreed to. So there's no labor, because there's the negotiations of the AI software and the contract. It's already been done, but you just have to approve. So here we say, here are 15 things that you want to do today that's just cool. Just cool. No economics, it's just a cool thing to do. And here's 15 that'll actually produce an income for you, which will pay for more than your lunch. That is not an impossible scenario. Now, in scenario 3, we think that by 2050, maybe as many as 3 billion people might be making a living like that. 5 minutes. Okay. Okay, so you got two geniuses here. They did a lot. So if we have augmented geniuses of the world, how much could the whole world do? I have glasses. I've augmented my eyesight. I don't have perfect vision. Right? Now, according to society, I'm okay. So what happens if we say it's okay for everybody to be a genius? You can augment your brain with all these things. So what kind of a world would that be? Elon Musk is hiring people to do it right now. You can do a Google search on Neuralink.com. Neuralink.com. Neuralace is the idea, and Neuralink is the company, and they want to be able to have an interface in your brain. How it works out is another question, but an interface such that if you took an IQ test and you're looking down at the paper, it's reading it and it's telling you that's the answer, that's the answer. Why wouldn't you get 100% on an IQ test? So this means behaviorally, not biologically, but behaviorally, we could all become geniuses. That's a different kind of a future. This is an integrated strategy of taking all of our stuff together, what would it mean to make the world work a little better, and I'll just give you an example of two of them. that I push. One is saltwater agriculture. We've got another 2.3 or so billion people coming up between here and 2050. And if the economic trends continue, they're gonna be richer, which means they're gonna eat more per capita, and also eat more meat per capita. Because even in India, when people get rich, they eat more meat. So how are you going to do this? So we already have problems with food today, let alone with all of that. And also your water tables are going down, as I mentioned. So how are you going to address all these things? Well, saltwater agriculture, there's a lot of species that can grow in saltwater. So imagine that if there's the saltwater edge, Mexico's got a nice lot of saltwater edge. I mean, wow, my God, you can do a fabulous deal with this. Anyway, you cut little inlets, and you're taking channels, and you grow in those channels of saltwater. Now it solves the #1 problem of agriculture. Rain. You don't care about rain. Rain's gone as a problem. You can grow shrimp in there, the waste can grow the algae can make the biofuel, etc., etc. And you can have all kinds of different plants in there growing. Saltwater agriculture also takes an area that's brown, coastline, desert area, brown, and turns it green. So you can get paid in cap and trade for the risk of your investment, right? Because you're a carbon sink. You're pulling in CO2, producing food. Okay, so you can read that later on. So those are all my comments. I think I'm leaving that one slide. Thank you.
Jerry, before you finish, could you please mention to them which are the 15 archaeologists because you just had them?
Okay, all right. Let's see here.
You just had questions.
Well, yeah, that's true. I can actually do them by memory, maybe.
That's right.
Challenge 1, and these are not in order of priority. In the same way, when you studied the human body, the systems that you studied were not in priority, even though you may have started with a circulatory system first. You take off the skeletal system and you're gone. You know, everything counts. So the argument whether energy is more important than water is ridiculous. If you want to do water, do water. Let me do energy. Don't argue. We got to do it all. So challenge 1 is how can we have sustainable development for all in the context of addressing climate change? By the way, politically, 450 parts per million is the goal. We're over 400 parts per million CO2 now. And we already have impacts now. So why is 450 sustainable? It's politically acceptable, but nature didn't get the memo. We got to get down to 350. So not only do we have to stop putting stuff in, we have to learn how to take stuff out. It's not just out, we've got to do both at the same time. Number 2, water. I've already mentioned that, the water situation, but just to underline a little bit, is that the water tables on all continents are going down. And between 40 to 60% of the world's population right now today gets their water. It comes from another country or 1 or 2 other countries that they don't control. So you take that plus the tables going down and you can see that the Nile may not get to Cairo. And the Nile doesn't get to Cairo. It's going to be war for sure. The Egyptians will never give up the Nile. Okay, so number 3 is population. How can population and resources be brought into balance? 4, how can authoritarian regimes evolve into democratic ones in a good way, and not have democratic ones reverse? Last 10 years, press freedoms are not going up, they're going down. 5, how can decision-making be improved with improved foresight? 6, how can the information and communication technologies work for everybody, including the AI and stuff I just talked about here? 7, how can the gap between the rich and the poor be reduced? 8, how can communicable diseases and immune microorganisms and new forms of disease be stopped from spreading worldwide fast? 9, how can we apply all this stuff of education that we're learning to make us wise enough to address all these challenges? 10, how can what we're learning about war and peace and conflict and so forth be applied to make a more peaceful world? And what have we got to pay attention to? 11, how can the, it's either organized crime or women. I'm not sure there's a relationship there. But anyway, let's say 11 is how... 9 is education.
9 is education.
10 is war and peace.
Yes.
11 is either organized crime or women.
No, it's women.
Women, okay. So, how can the changing status of women in the world improve the human condition as a whole? 12, how can organized crime be stopped from becoming a more sophisticated international system, essentially taking over more than we're willing to talk about? 13, how can we make enough energy plentiful that's safe and cost-effective for everybody around the planet? 14, how can we accelerate the science and technology breakthroughs that are really good for us? 15, how can we apply ethics to global decision-making in all of our activities? How do we get ethics in everything? So that's the 15 challenges. Thank you.
Ana María, me da mucho gusto que estés aquí. Sobre todo porque cuando estuvimos en la última reunión en el TEC de Monterrey, nos presentabas mucho el caso de los próximos 100 años. Y yo te decía, es que es muy importante que conozcas toda la labor de lo que ha hecho desde hace 22 años en el Project en el mundo, y que va más allá de lo que dice George Friedman respecto de sus proyecciones en los 100 años. Sí. Lo que más me gusta de Ana María, bueno, en primer lugar es una abogada brillantísima, en segundo lugar es una gran empresaria, es autora de libros, sus temas de seguridad son prioritarios para ella, pero lo que en particular ha sido subsecretaria adjunta de la defensa para políticas y temas de drogas en el Departamento de la Defensa de Estados Unidos. ¿Es correcto? Un poco complicado. Sí, pero lo que más me gusta de ella es que siempre está muy interesada en tomar temas candentes en sus manos y cómo los analiza y tiene esa objetividad. Así es que ahora tienes un tema candente.
No, muchísimas gracias y muchísimas gracias por la invitación. It's hard to speak after
Speak in Spanish, so I don't know what you're saying.
But I would like to highlight some issues here, and it has to do, like you said, it has to do from the way I view the world and trying to understand my analysis, which is a national security perspective. And the reason why I want to highlight that is because somehow, in trying to understand this book and trying to understand this proposal, it always comes to my mind, trying to figure out whether the way the challenges were selected did it depend on the fact that if those challenges were not addressed or the effects were not mitigated, the impact would be such that, you know, we're talking about the disappearance of the human race, or we're literally talking about the accumulation of democracies in the way we understand them. Because if we don't put that as the ultimate goal, it seems very hard that even with all this good work and the good intentions, trying to make governments face these challenges is almost impossible. And I know there's a lot of questions, because when you think about when you're talking, I'm glad you laid out the 15 points, because one of the points that is laid out is that we see democracies as the way of government around the world. That we don't believe in authoritarian regimes, and that all these proposals and all our challenges have to be moving towards making sure that it's done within the rule of law, that it's done in the way that you reduce conflict. But the reason you want to reduce conflict, because we all believe that that the human race must be governed by democracies. I think that's kind of the ultimate goal. Unfortunately, when you look at some of these challenges and what has been happening lately, the idea of democracy is not necessarily linked to to the idea of solving some of these challenges. And that's kind of why I want to lay it out, because ultimately I have to imagine that as you were talking about these challenges and trying to find solutions, the political environment and the ultimate objectives of certain ways of views of life, for example, the Chinese. I mean, I'm sure that when they see this document, and they see democracy, and of course, they have their own interpretation of what a democracy is, which clearly does not, that doesn't go hand in hand as we in the Western world would understand the issue of democracy. I'm sure they see this document, and it probably makes them nervous, some aspects of it. If democracy, the way we understand Western democracies, is the way we want to solve these challenges. So I just kind of want to lay that out on the table, because I thought it was fascinating when you said that you had the U.S. Army and UNESCO supporting part of this document. I mean, ultimately it has to do, I believe, that because within the U.S. Army or within the U.S. government, there's this belief that if these challenges aren't confronted, one, the view of, you know, not only the American view of life, but the way we view Western democracies could be at risk. And I think that is kind of ultimately one of the issues. And two, they're viewing that many of these issues, I don't know if all of them, which would be interesting to hear your comments on it, that if you don't resolve these challenges or mitigate the impact of these factors, that once again, you would have the democracy, or the way, you know, the Western world views democracies and how government should work would be at risk, or ultimately, you know, there's a question as the survival of the human race. And the reason why I put the term of the survival of the human race, because there are some issues there that are very, very concerning, that ultimately, if not addressed, does put at risk. And you know, when you start talking about terrorism, I thought, because the first time I asked was, why do you have terrorism up there? And because terrorism in Mexico is not viewed as a priority or an issue. But when you think of it in terms of a global threat and the impact of a terrorist attack in the United States, or a terrorist attack in, you know, in Europe or in other democracies, then you understand the impact of what terrorism could mean for Mexico. So I think I wanted to kind of highlight those issues, because ultimately the way the way of solving these problems require an enormous amount of cooperation between nations. An enormous. I mean, not just little, not the normal everyday, you know, you have a minister declaring in Europe that we have to fight global warming, whereas you have President Donald Trump continuing to insist, or his government, that it's not an issue, or maybe it's an issue, but clearly it is not a priority, that there's other priorities. So in order to solve this problem, you have an enormous amount of cooperation that is required. Cooperation that I'm not too sure is going to happen if you have this view of the world, which is most of the way the proposal, or the way you're going to solve these problems, is through the democratic systems. And that's kind of one of my first question marks, which leads me to the second question, or the second comment, I guess, which is, then we have to assume that in order to face most of these challenges, it's going to have to be civil society, or it's going to have to be the business community, or it's going to have to be actors that are kind of extracted from the political daily decisions of governments, which one way or the other are thinking in the short term, clearly not thinking in the long term, and may not necessarily have the same views of problems, the way their political systems are so different, or their view of the future of their political systems is so different, or the survival of their political systems is different. Which is an interesting thought, that if we're going to depend on civil society, literally what we're saying, well, it's not really society, it is these big major transnational companies, or it has to be companies, I would believe, that would be trying to laying the future, I mean, trying to figure out how to solve these issues. And the reason why these major transnational companies would be interested in solving these issues is ultimately there is something to gain for them. So I'm telling you all of this because one of my questions would be, if ultimately the solutions could be found through these major transnational companies, whether their solutions are not impacted by the fact that they have to be, they need to be successful. I mean, they have to have, they have to be successful in the long run. So that's kind of one of my first questions. And my second question, yeah, but I have to kind of go through that. I have to kind of go through that just so I can get to that. But that kind of would be my first question, and kind of my first thought or my first comment. And in second place, what has to be extremely frustrating is when I look at this, and let's say that you can get governments interested in the way of solving this problem. I'll finally get them interested, mainly because someone in their staff is saying this is a national security threat, or we have to think of these problems in terms of national security, right? And those of us who work in the national security realm basically think in terms of what are the threats, right? What has the most impact on our democracy, our society? How many people are going to die in my democracy if we don't confront these threats? How much is the quality of life of my people in my democracy is going to be impacted if we don't face this threat? And if their quality of life is changed thus, then they won't vote for my party or my party or my political system. And three, when you think in terms of national security threats and democracies, we always think in terms, does this threat a democratically elected president or a democratically elected government? And the reason why that is important in terms of national security, because that is the ultimate goal of these national, when you think of national security strategies in a democracy, is that you want to protect those types of, that regime, because we ultimately believe that is the best way people can grow, people can thrive, because they can be free, and they also they should have a better quality of life than in an authoritarian regime. That's kind of the way we think about these issues. So in trying to get these, when you think of national security and these threats, the ultimate problem is resources. Because when you have national security threats, you're going to put in the resources to those threats that are more likely to happen in the short run, and you want resources to mitigate the effects of those impacts. So in terms of trying to figure out how to get governments to support these types of, confronting these types of threats, I guess the huge issue is resources. And they always think in the short term, the threats that most you have to be looking at. So I guess my second question would be, what of all of these issues that you've laid out, the governments that you're working with or talking to are most concerned about? And I imagine terrorism is probably, in the short term, one of the issues that most concern, beyond water and making sure that we can breathe air in 30 or 40 years. I can imagine terrorism is one of those issues. So so what would be the other issues there that in the short term you've been able to mobilize the governments? And the third, when I look at this, and this is, I keep on thinking, how do you get, for example...
Getting over here.
I
forget, you gotta remind me.
No, but the third is, how do you get, for example, a Mexican government involved? And of course, we're in the middle of an electoral process, and I'm kind of looking at these, looking at these issues. And you would want at least the Mexican government to at least look at some of these issues if they, in the long term. And of course, the Mexican government has been very active in global, there have been green governments. I mean, they've been very active in the global warming, for example. Some would say for political reasons, but others would say that there are people within the Mexican government that are convinced that this is probably a good, an issue that we need to start confronting. I guess the question would be, how do you engage, for example, the future president, whomever it may be, to at least start talking about some of these issues in the long term, considering that most governments or most new governments are always thinking in the short term. So those are some of my questions and some of my comments.
Can I respond to this before I get another?
Let me just make sure to Maria something. We're working on the Mexico Tours 2050 challenges. So we have really a specific focus on what you're asking. And if we are considering transnational terrorism as part of transnational organized crime, is already included in the things and the approach the learning project has. Jerry?
Before everybody gets a little depressed, because answers to all of those questions are not all forthcoming immediately, here's something that I remind myself when I get a little bit depressed. If you listen to historians, we got some historians in the room? No? Do we have any hysterians? According to history, most historians, when two or more powers, tribes, clans, families, or whatever, confronted each other, they used the weapons of the day, sooner or later. That is a very large trend throughout human history. It was turned around. I was a little involved with the Cold War. I worked with Jerome Glenn for about 10 years. And it was generally believed by most people that World War III with nuclear weapons was inevitable. Of gray-haired people here. You remember. Remember, I mean, most people thought it was going to happen. When? I don't know, so let's have some tequila and get on with it. That's right. And the public had nothing to do other than pay taxes and pray. That was about to get it. Well, we didn't have it. Now, we may have information warfare and all kinds of it, but if I have a choice, when I hear somebody say, well, you know, the old Cold War was a lot easier, you just had a bipolar thing, a lot easier, now this is more complex, more dangerous. Ask them if they were involved in the Cold War. They weren't. There was a lot of ways we could not have entered. And I will take all the crap we have today over what we had as a threat then. And, so that's a reason to be optimistic. Because historians would say, no way, Jose, you are going to blow up sooner or later. That's it. Now, so that's to get over the generic pessimism. We can make it. We can make it, because that was considered to be impossible. We have so many ways to address climate change now. The issue is, what are we going to do? We have tons of answers to a lot of these things. It's all over the place. I list very precise actions under each of the 15 challenges in here. You get a page, and you get actions. You get a page, you get actions. Online, you get enough detail to make the academics happy. But on the book, it's very short to the point. Now, on China. China was one of the first 4 nodes in land projects. And they have published the State of the Future every year since then. The government. And the trouble with the government, they didn't promote it. So this last issue, we decided to go to the private sector. The trouble with the private sector was a nervous wreck about this.
Of course.
So it's delayed, 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 delayed. But I bring this up to say the only time we ever had anybody, and this turned out to be China, to say, can you change something? All the time, in over 20 years, which is really amazing. We do this sensitive stuff. Was, can you take out the word from dictatorships to democracy? Can you say authoritarian regimes? Fine. It's the same idea, but it made him happy. No, but that's okay. But that stuff is that's fine. So they have this thing has been translated into Chinese. It's been around. Now, are we moving in a more representative government? Well, one of the things in democracy, one of the things that the American Ben Franklin said very clearly in the beginning of the whole game for the United States was, the cornerstone of a democracy is an educated public. Not a public, an educated public. Well, we've got an awful lot of ignorance growing. In the past, ignorance did not get a microphone. Now, the internet gives a microphone to half the population of the world. Half the population of the world are not all enlightened. So we have a flood of nonsense, which is maybe like the baby. You don't throw the baby out with bathwater. You know, we're going through an evolution. We've never had a time where we, the human family, think together. And this is new stuff. You know, on which of these things, I go back to my first comment. I don't want to go to which, because it's like an opera. I don't ask a trumpet to be a violin. You know, it's a mix of stuff. Now, but to contradict what I just said, one of the areas where we had the greatest impact with governments has been environmental security. When we started environmental security, you may remember, there were no definitions and there were no divisions. Now, every military in the world's got environmental security. And if you take a look at the U.S. Army's environmental, every single period, comma, and colon we wrote.
But
there's an awful lot to say. Each one of those questions is like a flood of
no, but maybe I can make my question more direct. If you're going to resolve some of these issues within the democratic regimes, ultimately it is going to be different than the way you solve it in an authoritarian regime. So that's kind of my question mark.
That's one of the reasons why we use the trans-institutional model. The privatization of space was not done by NASA. Privatization of space is done by Elon Musk and the Amazon guy. You've got, but Bezos, you've got a really complex society in the world. We can't wait or rely on any institution to do, quote, it. What we have to do is say, hey, universities, why aren't you doing this? Hey, NGOs, why aren't you doing this? Private sector, hey, why aren't you doing this? Now, you go back to the private motive, let's take that one example of saltwater agriculture. How much money can you make in converting as much of the agricultural system of the world into saltwater? You won't convert all of it, obviously. But if you can create new sources of nutritious food, and, by the way, bioenergy, as well as protein, shrimp and so forth, that's a tremendous income. And, as I mentioned, with cap and trade, you can take off your risk on investment. You know? So there is a tremendous amount of money to be made on all of these things.
But what if the solution makes you lose money? See, that's what, which is the argument on global warming.
Yeah. All right. How much money is made in the United States today in solar energy, in new growth of energy, and wind energy? We still have much of our base in coal and oil. But where's all the growth coming from? Where's the new money coming from? And coal, if you take a look at the world statistics, coal started going down last year, first time. Right? Now, there's a lot of stuff in the environmental activities that makes a profit. You don't pay for the sun. You pay for coal. You don't pay for wind. You pay for oil. You know? So solar panels now have been shown to be cost effective with coal. And it's even more cost effective because you don't have collateral damage. And you have a better impact on employment. More people are involved. You know, you look at the employment industries, the coal employment industries, the solar and wind, and it's gigantically different.
So ultimately, we have to, it sounds like what you're saying, is that ultimately, in order to find solutions, we have to be focusing on solutions that potentially permit the survival of trends. And that's what kind of I'm mentioning, that the solution, I mean, ultimately, these solutions has to have an enormous input of transnationals and responsibility as transnationals. And that, but that they can make money off of it.
Yeah, sure.
That's kind of what you're saying.
I mean, my background is part Quaker. And Quakers, you may remember, gave the money to the King of England. And that's how they got Pennsylvania and Delaware. And their attitude on business was, the purpose of business is to solve a problem. You solve a problem, you get paid. You don't solve a problem, you don't get paid. Yeah.
Bueno, gracias. Le damos un gran aplauso a María. Ahora nos toca el joven del grupo. Eso es algo que me gusta mucho en Comexi porque una de las recomendaciones que se nos plantearon es que sean comentaristas jóvenes. Y lo que me gusta de él es su frescura. Además, su carrera es verdaderamente brillante. Primero como internacionalista, con una maestría en Derecho, posteriormente como diputado federal y después como empresario. Empresario muy exitoso, con 2 empresas que tiene, ¿sí? Una se llama Capital Partners y la otra es la Fundación Imagen México. Y lo que más me llama la atención de él es realmente cómo tiene esa gran sensibilidad para detectar cuáles son las mejores estrategias que podemos adoptar como país y despertarnos la conciencia de cuáles pueden ser los pasos a seguir. Agustín, bienvenido.
No pressure there. No, y aparte Ana María y yo tenemos un programa en TV Azteca, en ADN 40, todos los sábados de 8 a 10. La primera hora es en inglés y la segunda hora es en español. Probablemente el primer noticiero a nivel más, yo tal vez en el mundo, pero pues por lo menos aquí en México, así es que se lo recomendamos mucho, es un gran programa. So, transitioning to English, and then eventually transitioning to the Q&A at the end of this. This is big picture stuff. There are topics for everyone. I think that one of the takeaways is that each one of us has to find that area of interest where we are passionate and where we are willing to put resources behind, either personal or institutional, and I think that that's one of the big takeaways. We have to get away from the small picture stuff, which is MNCs are usually very good at, making puercas, making nuts and bolts. We got to get into the big picture stuff and see that everything is dependent on how we answer these questions. Nevertheless, predicting is very difficult, especially about the future, right? The old adage. And right now we are living in a world of a backlash against intelligence, right? There is a fetish for stupidity. There is a backlash against thinking. There is a brute force attack on the gut, right? I will think that I will feel this way, and therefore I will act in consequence, and it doesn't matter if it destroys the world because it feels right, right? Stephen Colbert called it truthiness, and I think that that's something that we really cannot, both Brexit, Trump, and all of these phenomena only exist in the context of this backlash. So there needs to be a strategic communications, because guess what, guys? The rest of the world doesn't trust us. And when you actually speak to a Jerome Glenn and our counterparts around the world, you realize that these are very well-meaning, well-educated, and very forward-looking people, but in the context of the corn farmer in Iowa or the Trump voter in general, we are the enemy. And right now, they not only have the megaphone of the internet, where everything becomes kind of news, but they have the megaphone of an anti-system establishment that is sort of these cartoon villains like Fox News and Breitbart, that seriously, when you like, even at first glance, they are literally the Lex Luthors of our age, and yet they have free reign. And in this coincidence of time and place, for some strange reason, some weird collective karma of the human race, they have resources. And they have the Mercers of the world financing them. These are multi-billionaires who are financing them. They have a plan. Right? They have a plan, they have money, they have the ability to permeate society, and they are anti-system forces of chaos in the old, if you were to go back to mythology, these are the forces of chaos that are actually gaining strength, and that is something that is not only horrifying, but it's something that we really have to understand how to deal with it, because we don't know how to deal with it, right? Reason does not work. This is the anti-reason movement, and it is winning. So in that context, there are a couple of texts I think that everybody needs to read, and I mean, let's just put it out there. It's not even negotiable. One is, of course, The Rational Optimist. You can pick up a lot of these facts and figures from this text. It's also very readable. The other two texts that I would suggest to everybody is Homo Sapiens and Homo Deus by Yuval Harari. It puts it into context and why Sapiens was the predominant hominid that ended up killing everybody else, and what it was about our collective intelligence, our ability to cooperate on a massive scale that changed everything and has brought us to the point that we are right now. Within 100 years, Homo sapiens will not be dominant anymore. This is, for all practical purposes, a fact. We don't know exactly what will, with via wetware and hardware coming together, or all of these different things, or maybe superintelligence, which, by the way, does not need to develop consciousness. It just needs to develop agency. There's a big difference. We still don't know the nature of consciousness. It very well could develop consciousness, but it doesn't need to. Just with agency is enough. And I think that we shouldn't lose sight of that. In terms of mental health, this is something that you can take home, Jerome. Mexico is the only country in my legislature, which was the legislature before this one that is ending. We had education reform, which is a massive thing. And we are now the only country that actually put in our education reform, in our education system, the need to articulate pro-social skills and emotional regulation. And so right now we are working with UNDP, specifically through a nonprofit that actually my wife is a part of, and they are implementing this pro-social skills and which in many ways is actually talking about mental health at the end of the day, right? It's using these tools that include things like mindfulness and that to generate what has been called sort of a universal ethics based on the ability to actually be conscious of our emotions and give them their due course. And I think that has to do everything with mental health. And that is fundamental, because if there is no platform for humanity to actually improve their mental health in terms of the regulating of their emotional, pro-social skills, of what are called socio-emotional skills, we are not going to get anywhere, and you're going to have those unitary actors that are going to be forces of chaos, that are going to be, having access to weapons of mass destruction and all of that, and therefore killing many people, and perhaps even becoming existential threats. So that is the foundation, and it shouldn't be. No, I'm not saying that you did, but it should never be mentioned in passing, right? The director of the National Institutes of Mental Health in Washington, D.C. was once asked, what is the definition of mental health? The definition of mental health today, he said, we don't have enough information. That's horrifying. We have to have a definition of mental health. We have to understand that mental health can't be augmented, that it is not simply living with your collection of neuroses and not hurting anybody, which is basically what we've come to believe. And we have to do a lot of work in that area. And Mexico, in fact, curiously enough, is actually a leader in that. We can talk about that later. So I think with that, just one last takeaway, there's this idea, Jerome, that you mentioned, vis-a-vis legislating trans-institutionalism. And I think that's something that we could certainly do. The Mexican political system sometimes throws up these little windows of opportunity, and Mexican legislators sometimes, they not necessarily are they the brightest, but they actually, they sometimes afford a little space through which we can actually legislate stuff like this. So I think Mexico is actually a good candidate for this to happen. And with that, Concepcion, I think it would be a good idea to open up the floor, yes. Unless you want. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, of course. Sure, of course.
I now have to write 10 more books.
Mention your first book, please.
Yes.
Actually, my first book was actually space travel. I got interrupted by 2 other books before Future, which he's referring to as Future Mind, where I talked about the merger of technology and consciousness. Is this back? Yeah. The merger of consciousness and technology on a continuum basis worldwide. Part of the idea is the old adage, if you can't beat them, join them. So if we can't beat that sequence of AI, the sooner we merge with them, the better off we'll be, is one strategy. That's where I put my bets, until I hear a better idea.
Which is actually Ray Kurzweil's approach as well.
I was before Ray.
But that's kind of where people are coming. Merge wetware with hardware.
I had a whole thing. But anyway, it's another story for another day. But yeah, that was called Future Mind. It was the idea of if you had, because part of the motivation was, can humans live without myth? And my background, my first degree, bachelor's degree was philosophy. So we would sort of say, yeah, you can do that, can't you? And I concluded, no, you can't. So if that's the case, can we create a new myth? What's the largest prejudice? One of the biggest problems in the future is prejudice, prejudging the future. You have that kind of tie, therefore you vote this way. Prejudging the future, prejudice. Now, what's the largest prejudice throughout all time, all cultures I know of? The tool makers and the consciousness sharers. You get people who say, no, we got to change consciousness. No, we got to make a new tool. No, we got to change consciousness. No, we got to make a new tool. So the mystic-oriented, and I don't mean religion, mystic-oriented, and the technocrat-oriented, if we can get a society where that's a yin-yang, where they one mutually creating the other on an ongoing basis, then apply that to education, defense, and technology, which is what the book does. the book is termed, as a matter of fact, the defense chapter, talk about defense. You go back to that defense chapter, you take out USSR, 30 years ago. You take out USSR, put in Russia, it reads like the present tense, unfortunately. Anyway, that was a little comment on that. Now, when you talk about the world moving in a certain direction, I'm not sure I believe that. What would this conversation have been different had a few tens of thousands of votes been different in 3 states? Well, you would have had Hillary and not Trump. Would the conversation be different? We wouldn't have pulled out of Paris, etc., 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 etc. So it's not inevitable in that direction. And I'm not sure that's where, I just came back from Pakistan. Pakistan is, used to be associated mentally with the terrorist state. Well, yet now, the terrorism is going down and down and down. And they're tracking new investments, and they're building all over the place. But who hears about that? Because we had the old model in our head several years ago. So now, on top of that, history did tell us that in Italy, before the Renaissance, all things great and glorious was Greek. Greek statues, Greek literature, Greek philosophy, everything was Greek. Suddenly somebody figured out they weren't Greek. And then boom, the Renaissance occurred. We tend to look backward for security. You have all of this stuff going on I've talked about, so a lot of people look backward and they go, oh my God, let me go back to the good old days when I could know what was going on. So, but then sooner or later we'll say, well, but we're not there. Now when that shift occurs, I don't know. It is occurring in certain pockets. You have your Humanity Plus people. Smell a little bit in there. Transhumanists and so forth. There are little pockets of different movements beginning to move another direction. So, and I would say also a thing that the elites made a big mistake on is by being rude. A doctor can diagnose you without being rude. And a doctor can diagnose you with being rude. Obviously, the doctor that isn't rude, you like, and you'll follow the advice. Somebody's rude, you don't like as much. So stop being rude. That's a basic, simple deal there. Yeah. And on all the information warfare stuff only works if there's fissures in your society to begin with. Information warfare gets in there and so we got to clean up our own house. One of the things I'm exploring is helping to create a way for the average citizen to fight all this stuff. Not only the ignorance being loud, but the ignorance that's dangerous being loud in information warfare. Princeton, there's a group in Princeton that has a proposal to monitor and track all this nonsense in some systematic way. What I'd like to do is support that and then have that connect to Facebook. Why? Facebook knows everything about you, so to speak, and says, here's something to buy or to do. What if I sign up and say, hey, I want to do my 2 bits to counter the nonsense? I'm in Mexico right now, I got this background, so whatever your situation is, Facebook's up to date. So Princeton could come out and say, here are activities that are coming up right now across the border, so to speak. Well, what are the various acts to counter it? And then that can go to Facebook, and Facebook can match up those criteria. And then you can get a prompt on your computer saying, by the way, I'm going to give a speech tomorrow. Would you like to watch it? And do comments on the comment. You can say yes, and you can say no. Right now, there's not an easy way for you to play in what you're talking about. Right? Well, so since Facebook was part of the previous problem, I'd like to give Facebook the opportunity to be part of the solution. And if they don't do it, then maybe somebody else. But since the target of information warfare is the individual's got to learn how to defend himself. That's a good one. But back on your major point about the know-nothings increasing, that may be, rudeness is part of it. A bigger part of it than we want to admit. That's one part of it. The second part of it, I think it is normal for people to turn back when they're insecure. Well, what if my parents do? I think that's a normal thing. But at some point, like with the Renaissance, you turn around. Now, how that's going to happen, I don't know. We've never done it in the world because all these Renaissance have been local stuff. We've never had a global
renaissance as such. Anyway, now to the...
Jerry, shall
Yeah.
we open?
Yes, yes.
¿Quiénes quieren? ¿Me pueden dar sus nombres?
Aldo
¿Hay
Funes.
alguien que puede...
Aldo Funes.
Aldo Funes.
¿Quieres pasarle el...
Tomamos, sí, por favor. Voy a tomar, ¿sí? Francisco Macarcia. Y pues si quieren tomamos otro.
Gracias.
Nadie. Y luego tenemos por acá Guadalupe. ¿Sí? Voltea para el otro lado. Gabriela. ¿Alguien más de ese lado? ¿Ya somos todos? Bueno, entonces empezamos por aquí.
Silvia Novoa.
Silvia. Muy bien, empezamos entonces por algo.
Okay, well, first, thank you very much for the enlightening talk. I understood that terrorism and corruption are on the rise, and we want to preserve democracy and decrease social gaps in general. The way I see it, human augmentation, I'm talking about biotech, Neuralink, and this interface with artificial intelligence, puts all of this in jeopardy. So my question, first of all, is has the related project studied the extent of the impact of human augmentation on society as a whole? And if we see this through, are we willing to accept these trade-offs in order to protect us from being dominated by another entity with more agency?
No, we have not done a specific study on it.
And, por favor, Blancarte, por favor. The person is Aldo. This is Blancarte.
Very good to see you again, Jerome, after 10 years in Washington, D.C. And I remember I gave you my paper, an essay to transform the United Nations into a World Federation of Nations. It was a crazy idea at that time because it was a direct proposal without the middle steps we have to make. I think our organization has matured a little bit, and we are proposing to walk towards a global law according to the recent technology that we have, like an iPhone connected for 3,000 million people, half of the world. We have microphone, as you said, 3,000 million people. So maybe let's walk toward a global law from the bottom to up with people through a proposal in 7 stages towards a world parliament of citizens. That's what would you think about it?
Thank you. Nadine?
Hello. Salim Ismail from the Singularity University. He mentions and emphasizes, of course he's a big optimist in my opinion, and talks about how we're moving from a world of scarcity into a world of surplus. And there is enough food in the world, it's distribution that's messed up. And for the first time we are in absolute democracy, thanks to the smartphone in my pocket. And everyone has the same ability, just as my vote is equal to the vote of anyone else in Mexico on July 1st. Now everyone has same access to same information all over the world. So that can be looked at as something optimistic. I look at it as an optimistic point. Then Yuval Harari, with Homo Deus and Homo Sapiens, one of the things that I'm concerned about, which he talks about in his books, is that the masses of our population were used in armies, and then they went to being farmers, and then they moved into being Walmart workers and truck drivers. Now, what are they going to do? Because we still will have those masses. They will not be working for my husband in his tech company. So where do we put them? And how do we prevent them from becoming angry, as Agustín mentioned, taking care of their mental health? Because that's the first thing that goes. So those two sides, those two people are big, they're playing big roles in my thought process. And how do they merge?
Gracias. Guadalupe?
Well, I have 2 questions. One is, Well, congratulations for all the global efforts. Well, congratulations for this enormous global effort. We have seen Conchita working for years on trying to build the Mexican branch. One question is, when you put this presentation in Asia, you put Mexico in the center? Because in the first picture, you had the global views and you had exactly the India in the front. So that's the first question. The word you put at the very beginning. And I noticed that it was not China. It was almost Central Asia. You put at the middle, which is the new route of the silk.
Oh, you're talking about all the list of the countries?
No, the map. The global, the map of
It is not really, it's an image.
The image. That one.
There you go. This one?
Yep.
Oh, because there's three. No matter what we did, we'd be wrong.
No, I understand
that's why we did three of them.
No, but my question is, when you put this in Asia,
no, it's the same one. It's a standard image.
Well, I think that starts with the first thing. Now we're working.
Also, all right, now this is not why we did it, but it's a good BS part.
Okay.
Take a look. You got more nodes in the middle. More in Europe.
Yeah, but
Europe is taking.
We are talking of images.
Yeah.
So I think that's an area. Yeah.
Oh, that one.
Media culture. It's not a question of ignorance. It's a question of how much the intelligent people or the smart people are supposed to be running the world better. I mean, I heard yesterday that the new prime minister in Italy, from the far right, has boasted about his culture way after the crisis of many years of governance inside. The UN has discussed 2 weeks ago, there was a high-level panel on global governance and sustainable peace. And I think the question of disarmament is related to that. And adding that and this goes to the second question, is what's your opinion on all this discussion about global law that is being pushed in Europe and in Latin America? Some law faculties are moving out the international law approach to the global law approach. I think that's an area of opportunity because it links parliaments. Yesterday, the UN Assembly has approved a resolution on strengthening the ties between the Interparliamentary Union and the United Nations. So I think that's another interesting area. Well, there are some former representatives here. No? Maybe they can take up here.
Hi, good. Well, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. And my question has to do with how to deal with these 15 global challenges that the Millennium Project is addressing. And I was hoping that you could elaborate a little bit more on how this concept of trans-institutionalism is going to help address these challenges, especially as it relates to structures of governance. Why do I ask this question? Because it seems to me, based on your presentation, that to deal with these challenges, we need not only very high levels of coordination across multiple stakeholders, not only corporations, but also civil society, academics, so on and so forth. So we need extreme levels of coordination. And we also need to be thinking in the long run, because solutions to these challenges will not come tomorrow. I mean, it will take time for this to happen. And that's why I think I would like to hear more about how these trans-institutionalism would work in your mind. Who would participate specifically, representing who? How would decisions be made? What would be the balance of power inside these trans-institutional instances? I work for a multilateral initiative called the Open Government Partnership. And this partnership promotes open government, but also open government to solve other big national and international problems. Mexico is a founding member of the organization, and the key part here is to promote government, civil society collaboration. And what we have seen is that it is very difficult to make sure these collaboration or multi-stakeholder forums, to give them a name, can persist over time because there are coordination problems, there are collective action problems. So again, the question, all this is, to sort of give context to my question, which is how are these trans-institutional instances conceived to deal with these problems? Thank you.
Y la última Silvia. ¿Sí? ¿Alguien más? ¿Me lleva?
Sí, gracias.
¿Alguien más? Para que puedan hacer una ronda completa. Yo, Concepción.
Cecilia.
Cecilia. Muy bien. Gracias, Cecilia.
Thank you for your interesting talk. You know that Mexico is one of the most unequal countries in the world. I mean, inequality in Mexico is huge, and violence is really getting worse and worse. I work for World Vision. It's a global humanitarian organization focused on children, and we do development programs in the most vulnerable communities in the world, in Mexico. And poverty have always been seen as something we have to solve, like the people that know how to do it, we have to solve. And when I go through the vulnerable communities, I always find children, smart, intelligent children that really want to do things. And they won't be able to have access to any of the information we are having today. And it's likely they will never have it because the inequality gap starts from a lack of basic education, and it starts open and open and open. And all these children that are not, that can access that kind of basic education, and the gap is keep opening, start migrating from the communities, and all the consequences of that, like being pregnant in an adolescent pregnancy, being recruited by narco-traffic, and all those consequences start to happen. So, from your perspective, and given all these new technologies, if there is something we can do for these children that can be the engines of change in their own communities, what would you teach them? What, if you can have a little budget to give them a small opportunity to change the way they are being educated, because we know that in Mexico with all these unions and politics around education, and even if we have the reform in education, that reform won't hit them soon, and we are losing all this generation of children. I have seen it because in the communities, not even, I mean, the teachers, even if they would like to change, they themselves also have the education, the right education to teach, but they are the only ones that's available in those regions. So if there's something that you can give them in terms of education so they can be really the agents of change, what would you teach them, given all these, ocean of progress and different technologies that would be possible for them to access in their time?
Gracias. Miguel Ángel?
Sí. Jerome, nice to see you again. what is your perspective about robotics and artificial intelligence in the relation with the employee? I'm concerned. I'm concerned because now we have a problem with some university careers. I give you an example. Now, with the development of the technology, I can get an app to translate any language. That means that I don't need to learn language or be or study to be a professional translator. What do you think about that? What we can do in the case of Mexico if in the next years some human jobs will be replaced for the mechanics, and of course what we can do with this technosocial challenge. Thanks.
Cecilia?
Yes.
Por favor.
Oh, that's a good exercise. Let's be very quick because it's about to finish. Jerome, you talk about this big question if people have to deal with needs. And yes, of course, we have to deal with needs. But when Ana Maria mentioned about the importance of democracy, I think in America it's almost a dogma, more than a myth, a dogma. And you are very sure that the whole world has to turn into democracy so they will work. And that's the truth. The Soviets did in 50 years what Europe did in 500. And then, of course, the Soviet system collapsed because people get fed up. And China, with so big population, so they have very educated people, they are powerful, they are rich, they have a capitalist mentality. India too, India with the middle class of 300 million is pushing the country, and they can just pull out the 400 of the very, very low class people. So not necessarily democracy is yes. And then also with this young lady question, that's my big concern. I think water, as one of the Millennium Trends, and 6 billion people you mentioned will be excluded. So this is going to be, as you said, like the new economic era, like the beginning of the 19th century when machines started to work for the textile industry in England and then in the upper Europe. Where are going to be this thriving? How they start? There's going to be turmoil, as you see one of the scenarios. So we have to think in more incentive ways. So how are we going to survive with this huge problem?
Y vamos a cerrar con Martín. No me pido la
Gracias, Conchita. Felicitar a Ana María. Okay, I would like to make congratulations to Ana María and Agustín for the reflections of this conference. Just a question, the first imagine that you put in the presentation, probably when you talk about the trans-institutionals, you put on 6 groups. The question is if there is any possibility that try to find that group, that the young people, the new generation, they're working in the net, webs and many things, included in that diagram.
Muchas gracias.
Okay, yes? Well, if that's all you have to say, then one, read the blankety blank scenarios. It's some of the best work I've ever done in 45 years. The 3 scenarios, you take a look at these technologies, the work on employment, which addresses parts of some of your questions here. Read them. And if you can, set up your schedule somehow so you got an hour off to the side somewhere. So you can read 1, then read 2, then read 3. Each one is 10 pages.
These are not normal scenarios that you usually get with just a couple paragraphs or a discussion about a future condition. That's not a scenario. A little advertisement for the author of them, Herman Kahn. Scenarios were invented to find out what you didn't know that you should know about the future. That you didn't even know you needed to know that. All right? Because when you write a story, you get to a point that says, I have no idea what happens next. That's good. That's the value of a scenario. Right? Right now, a lot of futurists will come around and says, here's a discussion about this condition. That's a good idea, but that's a vignette, or that's a discussion of the thing. There's no learning going on. So when I wrote these 3 scenarios, I did a lot of learning. I didn't know. I found out nobody in the world I could find has a cash flow projection on guaranteed income. All these people talk about it. No one's got a cash flow projection. It's a basic thing. So then I had, so now I just got a message from the guy today in the 5-star movement, a former intern of mine, who's now working with Italy to do a cash flow projection. Yeah. So we'll see. But by the way, the 5-star movement is a crazy collective of different kinds of players. It's not, they made a deal, which they didn't think they were going to do, with the right wing. So they're not per se right wing. They have right wing in it, you got left wing in it, but what they're trying to do is say, what are we going to do? Skip all the ideological stuff. Now, they may get trapped back into that, I grant you. But anyway, so, scenario, so 1, please get a hold of the scenarios. Get a pirated copy from Conception maybe, but or buy it, whatever, or download it, or read them, and think, and note-taking, because there's probably more good stuff to think about in those 3 scenarios than anything else I've ever read, except for maybe Future Mind, other than that. So that's 1. Go back to terrorism on the rise. Technically it's not. When we did this study for NATO, it turns out that the terrorism rate in Europe was a heck of a lot higher about 15 to 20 years ago. The rise of social violence, yes, we can't say it's going down. But the transborder stuff has almost disappeared. You know? Human augmentation impact, yes, we should do a study on that. That's what Future Mind essentially was to a large degree. But that was my own book years ago. That's 30 years ago. Now I got to change the verb tenses. But that would be interesting. But maybe, so if we do it, it'll be your fault. But that would be good to do a study on all of the implications across the board of augmentation. If we really had that future, what are the impacts? Some of that is covered, by the way, in scenario 3 of those 3 word text scenarios. Yeah, ISOs, on world law and world standards and all of that sort of stuff. One of the unsung heroes in this conversation is ISO, the International Organization for Standards. This is a global, participatory process that anybody can initiate. Doesn't mean they're going to win, but you have a right to initiate a standard. And if you do it and it's cool and you attract people, that is a slow motion, global, participatory ethical system involving. You may or may not know that when the UN started, there was supposed to be 2 sections, nation states and people. Well, they couldn't work out the people, so they ended up with what they call the World Federation of UN Associations, under which we worked for a little while. The idea was any country can create a UN association, and that thing is a member of the world. That was the compromise. That conversation is evolving with new initiatives like you're talking about. And my guess is that we will have such a complexity, it'll be hard for us to understand today. You can't explain easily your cell phone. It's an extremely complex instrument. Is it a calendar? Yeah. Well, wait a minute, I thought you said it was a telephone. Oh, it's a camera. Well, wait a minute, I thought you said it was a prompting on your exercises, etc. I think the complexity of human society and the democratization of that will be quite complex. I think that the movements you're talking about will be part of what happens. I think the interreligious dialogues will be one of the things that happens. I think that, now by the way, I don't like the word trans-institutionism. Well, because an ism is an ideology. And we've killed enough people over ideologies in the past. That's why we push for humanity plus rather than transhumanism. Because, you know, I'm in and you're out, and therefore bang, bang. But a trans institution is, one of the mechanisms for making it happen is attraction. I did not recruit the nose. I did not recruit with the study. All of these things were like pulled together. So the idea, let's say you made a trans institution on making childhood education more successful. Right? Who in the business community in Mexico wants to play? Maybe it's only 2 or 3, fine. Who in the academic world wants to play? Maybe 2, fine. So you attract all the, so they self-select. So you don't have to manage them. A complex management system is difficult to manage by definition, right? So if I hire you, I have to manage you. I don't have to hire. I don't have to manage. Conception's going to do her own stuff, with my agreement. You know, but that's the way it works. So you attract people into these categories. You can't have everybody, you know, doing everything. So the idea of the trans institution is you're attracting the best of interests of whatever the organization is to be. Like you got a trans institution for each of the effective challenges. You got a trans institution for anything. We're a trans institution for future stuff. Right? So you can just take the same exact model, but then apply it to something else. Let's see. Let me get back to the organization again. Salam is a friend of mine, by the way. I lectured 4 times. I gave more talks at Singularity the first year than anybody else. Now, you don't need me anymore. But you asked before about the employment stuff. And the masses and so on. How, if you have a standard thing, then people compete to get to that standard thing. Where I was as a Peace Corps volunteer in Africa, you could be a farmer, a fisherman, a witch doctor. That's it. You know, now you can do some more. You can be a teacher, you can be a couple of other things. But you can be yourself. How many people were born and died and never found out who they were? Right? I mean, when you listen to these very rich entrepreneurs, they almost always say the same thing. I followed my passion. Okay, well, what's your passion? So education system, and I'll get back to your question in a minute. The education system should have the ability for you to find out where your passions are and make mistakes and find out if that really is your passion. Salam will tell you that they give an award for failures. Right? So if there's one standard and one way to go, then you fail or you succeed. And you're terrified to take any risks because of failure. But how do you fail at being yourself? You fail at being yourself by not being yourself, by not experimenting, employing. Education system should have self-actualization as part of the game, so that you find out. And then how do you connect that passion, or passions plural, to the world? In the past, you had to walk to the market. We all revolved around the market. Now half the world has half the world revolving around every member of half the world. You don't teach people to think that way. Right? Now let's say that you are really interested in scratching your nose on the right side. Right? How many people in the world are interested in scratching their nose on the right side? Maybe out of all those billions of people, there's only 10. Well, if those 10 were interested in putting in $1 or whatever into some scratching your nose thing, I'm being silly, you realize, then that's enough for you to pay for lunch and dinner and breakfast the next day. Or let's say juggling. Like take out a thing, how many people want to learn how to juggle? I'm going to just think of all the things that you really want to do. Or let's say I'm coming to Mexico. I could have had a little group class and said, all right, I'm going to Mexico. Who wants to go to the Anthropological Museum with me? You know, put in, you know, $1 in my account. So I go to the Anthropological Museum, I'm walking around, and, you know, maybe 100 people. Oh, $100 is a pretty good lunch. You know? So the idea is, how do all these people get employed? They don't. They get self-employed. They make a living out of connecting themselves with the world, with this little avatar I told you about. It goes searching around the world, comes up with opportunities for you, and you start to make a living out of being yourself. How many people can do that? Everybody that gives it a try. Like, for example, I'm interested in doing what I'm doing right now. So I connected around the world. So I'm self-actualizing. I am a better futurist now than I was 10 years ago.
because of this activity. So, and it also gives you a competitive advantage because you can be a better you than I can. Right? So, how many people can be employed that way? Literally everybody. If we have artists doing television shows, it shows how that happens. We do movies, it shows how that happens. Rock and roll music or other music, you know, the 60s culture change in the United States was run by music. And the music was run by the music writers. And the music writers hung out with a guy named Timothy Leary. Fact. Well, no, but fact. The point is that a lot of these things will not work if the arts and culture don't reinforce that view of yourself. So all of these things, each one of these things by themselves will not work. But the combination of them, the integration of these things, that's why I read scenarios. It shows how these things can fit together. 4. Well, I mentioned about Wufun and global law, because some of those things were interconnected. Let's see. Trans-institutionalism, transition, we got that. Structure of government. Yeah, that's another thing, too, is much of the world has grown up with the idea that if it's going to be done, the government has to do it. Now, slowly we're realizing the private sector can do some stuff. Universities can do some stuff. So the idea of relying on government decision could be an error. If governments do it, great. Why rely on it? If universities can do some of this, great. If business can do some of this, like I was talking about the agriculture, great. The idea of and I heard or in a lot of these things. Try to take out the word or, put in the word and when you can. Yeah? So we need this and that. Is it this or that? This and that. Also, start to think of universities teach competitive intelligence in business schools, right? Anybody teaching synergetic intelligence? Anybody teaching synergetic advantage? Anybody teaching synergetic strategy? What would Mexico's synergetic strategy be with the rest of the Western Hemisphere? I was just giving a talk at OAS yesterday on some of this sort of stuff. So, you got incredible talent, it's not coherent. We got software to help coherence. Boy, it's hard to cover all these things in a short period of time. Let's see. Oh yeah, the education stuff. And also the Singularity University. And they created. There's an Education X Prize. Have you heard about this? All right. The original, I was on the original team. I didn't do my email, so I got dumped off after a while. But the original idea, and I don't know if they're still doing it, the original idea was, what thing, and that thing can be defined any way you want, if left in a village, no electricity, no, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, like exactly what you're talking about, what thing would be there that could teach reading, writing, and numeracy in 6 months to, say, a 3-year-old. So by the time they hit elementary school, they're already running. You think of how much time we spend in elementary school. To learn what? Squish it down. It's not that much. Can you squish it down and give it to somebody in 3 years old? So that's what the X Prize is. So you can do a Google search on X Prize education. I don't know the status. I think they did pick 4 or 5 folks. And they're supposed to do synergies among them for the final winner. But the very act of asking that question has stimulated, I think, over 8.
Now, sorry, Jerome, the big push for Singularity, Celine Ismail, is that when you enter the short-term course, which is what has been done at Nassau University, is how can you change or affect positively 1 billion people?
Yeah, I know.
So that's what they're more emphasizing on. Their challenges, what do you do after that?
Yeah, but the X Prize came out of the same team. The X Prize is a separate organization. It's not the Singularity. But they're all in the same clubhouse. It's the same cast of characters.
Positive change.
Crush it down, crush it down. Okay. Let's see here.
Unless you went to 3 of them.
Yeah, right. Let's crush this down here.
Yeah, on democracy, I agree with the point. Singapore did quite well. South Africa had a dictatorship. South Korea had a dictatorship. However, for the record, people don't know this, Park Chung-hee was an elementary school teacher. How did he come up with the greatest economic growth in history? Huh?
He went to Harvard.
I don't remember that part of it. He had a futures hanging out with him for 10 years. Herman Kahn. He used to go there, they would talk. And the idea was, because normally people ask the futures to do what I'm doing right now. Instead, what he did is he hung out with the guy for 2 or 3 days, and then he'd come back about 2 or 3 months later and hung out again. Because day-to-day decisions are not, you're not going to go back to the book. The day-to-day decisions, you're on the phone, you have to change the mind over time. And hanging out with Herman Kahn for 10 years was part of that game. The book was written about it by Chung-hee Park. The trouble is they can't get it published because the people who don't like to be reminded that somebody outside had some help don't want to publish it. The people who don't want to give credit to him because he was a pretty tough dictator don't want to publish about what he reminded. So basically, no one wants the book published. But yes, the idea of saying one model is the way to go, I agree, is wrong. It's especially wrong when you talk about spreading democracy. You spread icing on a cake. Democracy is the cake, not the icing. Democracy is a culture of responding to people and people being responsive. It's a two-way street. That's culture, it's not spreading a surface. Now, the idea of the Chinese model, you can't deny it. Right? So I agree that democracy is something that we sort of want, but there's going to be future forms of democracy. Remember I said, whatever you look at in the future is going to be more complex than you think. And then double it, and you get closer. So what's the future form of democracy? It could be really complex. You know, an orchestra is simple, an opera is more complex. We're moving toward the opera sort of thing. And there's also fluid in Challenge 4, we talk about different kinds of democracies. And we should experiment with sort of these and explore them. Let's see. Now, on the AI employees stuff, read the scenarios. That's what the scenarios get into on that. Let's see.
We're done.
We're done? Okay. What are you there to?